This is Chapter 3 of The Americans, The Growth of a Young Nation. If you look at this box here, you'll see some of the more important topics we're going to deal with in Chapter 3. First, would you support the federal or your state government? Other issues we'll look at in this chapter are listed here in these questions. What might happen if some states enforce laws and others don't? How can Congress address the need for different states? And what does it mean to be a nation? On page 112, you'll see the beginning of Chapter 3, Section 1, the Jeffersonian Era. The main idea of this chapter was that during the presidencies of Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, and James Monroe, the country grew in both size and prestige. The election of 1800 is significant because it shows that our system could work in a peaceful way without resorting to violence to choose the next leader. In the election of 1800, the election was essentially a tie between three different people, John Adams, Aaron Burr, and Thomas Jefferson. It came down to pretty much a choice between Aaron Burr, a Federalist, and Thomas Jefferson, a Democratic Republican. The tie was broken because the system requires that when the Electoral College is tied, the House of Representatives takes a vote and they choose the new president. 35 votes were taken before they could decide on Thomas Jefferson. The thing that broke the tie in the House of Representatives was a deal that was cut by Alexander Hamilton. You'll see him described right here. Alexander Hamilton, while he was a Federalist, hated Aaron Burr, and he cut a deal with Thomas Jefferson to get the National Bank approved. And in exchange for this National Bank, Thomas Jefferson got the votes to become the President of the United States. When Thomas Jefferson became president, he decided he wanted to simplify the government under his political philosophy of Jeffersonian republicanism. This is the belief that the people should be in control of the government. Jefferson famously said, "The government that governs the least governs the best." He wanted limited national government, and that's an American tradition. He also shrank the size of the army, halted the expansion of the Navy, and lowered the expenses for government social functions. Alexander Hamilton, as Treasury Secretary under George Washington, had greatly expanded the role of the national government. Jefferson scaled all of that back. Also during the Jefferson presidency, we see the development of the courts to a new level. John Marshall and the Supreme Court had a case before them, Marbury versus Madison. And John Marshall declared that Congress's Judiciary Act of 1789 was unconstitutional. This is known as the power of judicial review, which is the ability of the Supreme Court to declare a law, in this case an act of Congress, unconstitutional. On page 114, you'll see the other significant event in Jefferson's first term described here, the Louisiana Purchase, one of the most important events of the early American period. The Louisiana Purchase was controversial not because of the size or the $15 million price tag, but Thomas Jefferson violated the Constitution when he authorized the purchase of the Louisiana Territory. However, Congress ultimately approved it and the purchase was made. On page 114, you'll see the next presidency of the United States, the presidency of James Madison, who took over after Thomas Jefferson left office. During the Madison presidency, the United States gets involved into a war with England. The war was based primarily upon territory that we wanted from England in Canada, and we wanted to take territory in Canada away from them and give it to the wealthy here in this country. Like the Revolutionary War, the War of 1812 was a war that was fought for the benefit of the wealthy at the expense of the middle and lower classes. However, the excuse that we were given in the War of 1812 was that the British were impressing American sailors, or in other words, drafting them into the British Navy. The war went very badly for the United States. During the War of 1812, the British burned down almost every city and town on the eastern coast, all the way down to Washington, D.C. The British actually burned down the White House during the War of 1812. What's significant about the War of 1812 was that it was a major loss for the United States. England eventually went home, but they didn't recolonize the United States. Our national anthem was written during the War of 1812. Francis Scott Key was watching the British destroy the port of Baltimore. From the ships, he watched the British bombard our forts with cannon fire all night long. And in the morning, when our, quote, when our flag was still there, we declared victory. Even though the city was burned down, even though the fort was destroyed, even though the British won the battle, the United States considers the War of 1812 a huge victory. This gave birth to the era of good feelings, a time in which the United States began to feel more like a strong and independent nation. It's ironic because usually a nation doesn't feel strong or independent after losing a war. On page 116, you'll see the presidency of James Monroe discussed here. Here, notice the Monroe Doctrine. The Monroe Doctrine was the statement by the United States that we would not allow European empires to colonize in Latin America. This may sound like a very nice thing, when in fact what it really is the foundation for our imperialism. The idea that the United States would control this new continent and that the Europeans would not. On page 117, please notice that the vocabulary for this section is listed here. Please continue to make vocabulary cards and vocabulary lists to help you study. On page 118 and 119, you'll see the case of Marbury versus Madison discussed in detail. Make sure you read this carefully because this lets you see how the U.S. Constitution is a flexible document. And it also helps you understand how the law is used when it's expanding the powers of the government. Notice here, this is where the power of judicial review comes from. These cases were used to justify an interpretation of the Constitution that allowed the Supreme Court to claim that it had the power to declare laws unconstitutional. This is the power of judicial review. This is a power that wasn't stated in the Constitution, but it was a power that was created by the courts. And whenever a government creates a new power, we need to pay close attention. On page 120, you'll see the beginning of Chapter 3, Section 2, The Age of Jackson. This is also known as the Era of the Common Man. On page 121, you'll see how other technologies also impacted the growing country of the United States. Notice here the picture of the cotton gin, invented by Eli Whitney in 1794. This is a very, very important technological invention because it made cotton much more efficiently produced. It allowed for more cotton to be grown, more cotton to be picked, and more cotton to be refined and sold at market. We often think that technology makes our lives easier. But in the case of the cotton gin, it actually increased the oppression of human beings. Cotton was typically picked by hand, and the seeds were removed by your use of the fingers. The seeds were razor sharp. That's why slaves were used to pick and process cotton. The cotton gin allowed the seeds to be removed much faster. By grinding it through the cotton gin, the seeds would pop right out. This meant that you could pick more cotton and process it much more quickly. So that meant more cotton was planted, and therefore more slaves were needed to pick the cotton. On page 122, you'll see Clay's American System. Henry Clay promoted the American system because it would help American industries develop. The United States wanted to have a stronger industrial base, and therefore it raised taxes on imports from Europe and tried to increase support for American businesses. The Missouri Compromise was over the question of whether slavery would be allowed in the new state of Missouri. So as part of the Missouri Compromise, Missouri was allowed to be a slave state, and Maine was created and made a free state. On page 123, you'll see the election of 1824. This was the election that brought John Quincy Adams to the presidency. It was very controversial because many people felt the election had been rigged by Henry Clay to select John Quincy Adams over Andrew Jackson. Between 1824 and 1828, many states eased property requirements for voting and allowed more people to vote. In 1828, Andrew Jackson was elected to the presidency, and he brought with him the spoils system. He did this by hiring supporters to positions in the new government. Essentially, if you were a friend of Andrew Jackson, you had a job waiting for you in Washington. On page 124, you'll see one of the darker moments in American history under the Andrew Jackson presidency. This is the Indian Removal Act and the Trail of Tears discussed here. The Trail of Tears and Indian removal are a disgraceful moment in American history because once again we see land as the most important guiding principle for our government. And we see the oppression of minorities being used to make white landowning males more powerful. On page 126, we see a discussion of Andrew Jackson's bank war. Instead of having a national bank, Jackson broke up the national bank into state banks, which they were called pet banks because of their loyalty to the Democratic Party and Andrew Jackson. However, on page 127, you'll see that what happened was with the breakup of the national bank, it led to a lot of speculation in the economy as local banks, or pet banks, gave out loans that weren't very wise. This led to the Panic of 1837 and essentially collapsed the economy of the United States. So that when Andrew Jackson leaves office, he is basically handing a depression off to his successor, Martin Van Buren. And Martin Van Buren only lasts for one term. The economy is so bad, everybody hates Martin Van Buren for it, and in reality, he didn't have anything to do with it. It was Andrew Jackson who collapsed the economy by breaking up the national bank. After Martin Van Buren, the next president is William Henry Harrison, who was known as Tippecanoe for a battle that he won against Native Americans in 1811. William Henry Harrison unfortunately died very soon after his inauguration. He gave such a long inauguration speech that he contracted pneumonia, and the pneumonia killed him about a month later. This left his vice president, John Tyler, as the president of the United States. And John Tyler was pretty much hated by almost everybody in the government, and very little happened as a result. What we see after Andrew Jackson's presidency is a time of economic difficulty and political struggle. Please also note down here at the bottom is the section that includes all of the vocabulary for Chapter 3.2. Please continue to make vocabulary lists and note cards.